Good to be on the podcast with you today, Charles.
Likewise.
I want to start off telling you about quite an interesting thing which is popping up all over the news in China-centric news or news that is about China, and that's that there's a 19th century Chinese board game which is making waves around the world.
hmm
And I'm sure you know what the board game is called.
Mahjong.
That's right, yeah, mahjong. So have you played mahjong before, Charles?
I have sort of stood by and voyeuristically watched old people in Chengdu stay up until 5 a.m. Just hopped up on tea and baijiu and nothing else but that and mahjong. Works. It seems pretty complicated or a sort of Texas poker level complicated, but thank you, dog. But no, I'm not sure how. I've never played it before. How about you, Kieran?
Sure, I've played it a few times. I first played it when I arrived in China around 10 years ago.
hmm
And yeah, I went to a youth hostel, and some people, the owners taught me how to play. But then since then, it fell by the wayside, and I only recently played when I went on a business trip to Chengdu again. But I was being guided all the time, and people were quite frustrated because it's a very fast-paced game.
It is.
But the latest news is saying that there's been, in terms of just clicks, there's a Crazy Games, which is a website, has basically said that there's been a 23.4% increase in online clicks in the US of this game.
Mm.
Of course, that could still be mainly Chinese who live in the US or people of Chinese descent in the US. But either way, it's showing that it's something which is surviving the test of time and the test of immigration. So that's the first thing. There's also, if you look at the stats as well, I don't have them with me right now, but there's countries like Turkey are playing the game online. So that's interesting as well, I'm sure. I mean, only thing Turkey and China have in culture is the tea culture.
Absolutely.
So, but I suppose, as you said, tea and mahjong might go together.
Now, is this a you mentioned Crazy Games is it a gaming company and are they maybe behind this push for Mahjong?
Crazy Games is a gaming platform. Think to me, I understand it to be like Steam, but it's all games that can be run online. And
Yeah.
yeah, I only found out about it through doing this research, but they have companies which analyze their data, and one of the analyses which came out was the level of clicks that Mahjong was getting in different countries. So I believe Crazy Games is in fact an American company.
hmm
Yeah, and then, but Eventbrite, you would have heard of before. Basically, just analyzes events, and you can learn a lot about what's popular and what's vogue at the moment by looking at the events on Eventbrite and analyzing that data. And Eventbrite is saying that there's been a 179% increase in mahjong events. Um,
In the US alone. That's very interesting because it coincides very much with the, I don't know if you saw maybe about a month ago, the whole meme of you find me at a very Chinese time in my life. So the increase of like wearing slippers inside your house, not wearing shoes inside your house, which I, for one, am a big advocate of. I've been fully brought over to the dark side on that one, or to the bright side.
yeah.
And also drinking hot water, which I'm semi-sold on. Uh, I wonder if it has to do with that Chinese culture is in its fully original 5,000-year-old or 8,000-year-old self is proving to be a pretty viral soft power machine for China. If I just look at it again from a purely content-driven point of view, because that's what's easily measurable, right? Is to look at what's trending on, for example, TikTok and YouTube. And it's very often these soft living country lifestyle things where people will show you how to make ink from scratch, for example. So they'll have these very honestly, I could watch them for hours on end. Is these videos where someone will take, for example, pine resin, they'll take it from the trees and they'll take the ash and whatever they use to make the ink, and it'll be like a traditional Chinese production process where they show how this thing is actually made. And these videos obviously do extremely well on TikTok, despite being traditionally Chinese. in terms of their cultural context. But I guess it's just a function of that the Chinese social media content ecosystem is so huge,
Yeah,
and it's such a massive machine that it gets the top content naturally gets selected out and goes onto Western platforms. So I guess that if you're pulling off millennia of history, there'll be some good stuff in there,
yeah,
whether you pay influencers or not, which is pretty standard practice for investment and tourism promotion bureaus around the world.
sure. Another thing as well, which is if we're looking at brands now, what I wanted to get onto next, Charles, is what do you know about Chinese brands? Because it's always been in people's minds that China is very good at creating, refining raw materials and then sending out semi-finished products for them to be assembled or for them to be kind of, you know, refined and given finesse in foreign markets. But it hasn't been, a common thing for Chinese brands to be really successful overseas. There's always been a stumbling block there because brands are not just about price.
Sure.
There's much more to it. But now we see what's it called? Labubu.
Yeah.
Sorry, I always say Lalabu. What do you know about Labubu, Charles?
Cool. No, I'd like to kind of share with the audience just some new stats that have just come out of PopMart, which is the company behind Labubu. So they just announced their revenue numbers for 2025, 37 billion Chinese yuan. That's about 5.4 billion USD.
Yeah,
And that's 200% year over year growth, obviously driven in large part by Labubu. What's interesting about how PopMart actually works, and I wanted to kind of shine a bit of a light on how their internal team actually comes up with these hits like Labubu, because
yeah,
they've not just come up with Labubu, they've come up with products like Molly, Demo, and Pucky, the Fragments, Sunny Boy, which have all made them literally billions of Chinese yuan.
yes,
So I'd like to shine a light on how they actually develop IP because they don't work like Disney or Pixar in the slightest. They don't build movies at all. They build very loose character outlines and concept playbooks and sort of just more the vibes. They'll sketch out vibes for characters. And their internal team works on a very massive scale. They output about 30 to 40 concepts per month. And what they will then commonly do is they will collaborate with outside artists. So they'll bring in outside artists. So let me give you kind of a rundown of their key IP. So to give you just a kind of a breakdown of their key money makers, Labubu was developed fully in-house by the PopMart team. They didn't actually bring in any collaborators or other artists for Labubu.
yeah,
Molly was done with a Hong Kong artist, I believe, with Kenny Wong. Demu was
yeah,
done with Ian Dung, and then Pucky, the Fragments, and Sunny Boy were all developed internally. These are smaller sort of IP units. So a very interesting aspect, and this is something that we want to maybe touch on quite commonly when we talk about China, is I don't want to say gambling because that's a bit of a heavy, strong word, but definitely the slot machine effect of what they use, and that's blind boxes, 盲盒 in Chinese. You'll buy a box from a PopMart vending machine. For those of you who've been to Shanghai or to China anywhere, you'll know about this, and that is that you'll buy a box. It will say which character is in the box, but it will not tell you which iteration of the characters in the box. So you're not sure what kind of Labubu doll you will be getting. You could be getting a very rare Labubu doll, or you could be getting a fairly common iteration. So that brings in an element of randomness and a slot machine effect. So it's been very successful for them in terms of driving repeat buying compulsively, especially with sort of Gen Z and young consumers, is compulsively and obsessively buying blind boxes again and again and again. And then what's very important about what Labubu and what PopMart does is they have a community layer. And as we all know, Gen X and maybe Gen Alpha are historically lonely generations. They're isolated generations. They don't have the social, interactive, sort of connective tissue that other generations have had. Here is where PopMart creates a community layer of, for example, if you buy a blind box and you already have a certain iteration of a Labubu doll, you can then go and trade it in, for example, in China, they have WeChat groups where they trade. Basically, there are online communities in which people can trade and resell. So that also creates that becomes a sort of a social currency. It's more than just a toy. So basically what PopMart then does is they have this community layer, they have this insane scale, and they tend to heavily use AI in social media listening. So they'll kind of keep their eyes and ears also assisted through AI on TikTok, Bilibili, on RedNote, on Douyin, looking for IP that's going quite viral. And then they'll kind of make micro bets through collaborations that controls their capex, that they don't have to go all in on, for example, on Mickey Mouse. Like, for example, Disney did with Mickey Mouse. They can launch dozens and through analytics, find which ones are the true winners and scale the winners and just sort of warehouse and put the losers aside. So I just wanted to give a quick breakdown of how exactly PopMart works. It's a fairly interesting, it's a very Chinese approach to actually being very creative and creating this kind of creative innovation at scale. So Kieran, I don't know if you are or are not perhaps the owner of any PopMart products.
Shoal, I was. Someone gave me a little Pop Mart ugly doll as a gift, and I had it on my backpack, which I walk around with in Shanghai. And it was supposed to be a cute thing. However, friend of mine's girlfriend, saw it and said that she didn't have that specific doll and had been looking for it for a while.
Mm.
So I think we did a trade or something. I think he bought me a beer and I gave this thing to his girlfriend. Or he bought me two beers probably because it's worth at least two, three beers.
I bought a Monsters Inc. blind box at one point because I was so interested to see how the vending machines work. So I bought a few. I got a Squidward and I got a something from Monsters Inc. as well.
Okay.
Labubus, I did not really buy into the trend. It seemed I kind of watched it from afar.
Yeah.
But it did seem like people were going quite crazy with trying to get the complete set. And that just goes to show, that the girlfriend of the friend of yours who, was willing to pawn two beers for to get the complete set. Yeah, it's quite impressive to see the lengths that some people will go through for a full set of Labubus.
No, absolutely. And I was also with my partner when we visited her niece. She said we have to go to Pop Mart. That was the first thing that came to her mind. And we spent about 20 minutes in Pop Mart with boxes, kind of, just trying to listen in the box to see which kind of doll it is. And then a guy came over and he said he's an expert on it.
Oh my
And he can
word.
tell by just shaking the box around which doll is in there.
That's ins
So he asked us which doll. This was a guy who was certainly, we'd call it Gen Z, but in Chinese we'd call it Ling Ling Ho, which means he was born after 2000.
Yeah.
He was probably early 20s. So he helped us shake the box and he told us that this was the doll we were looking for after about 20 minutes. So we spent about half an hour in there and eventually got the doll we were looking for, which we knew that the niece didn't have. And it cost me 180 RMB, so a good $25.
Hmm.
Not cheap at all. The doll is quite solid. It's got a solid feel to it.
Yeah.
Um, but yet I don't understand it. And
Do you mind me
it's one of,
asking,
yeah,
did you pay 185 RMB just for the doll, or did you pay a little fee to the Labubu listener?
we didn't pay him anything. He was just
Oh,
like
okay.
somebody who was probably just really glad to help, which you often get in China, somebody coming up to you and just helping. I'm sure you get that in many parts of the world, but there are no strings attached most of the time. So
That's a pretty marketable skill, though. You know, they always said to us when we were studying that the most millennials are studying now for jobs that don't exist yet, and who knew that that would? But that's an insane skill to have.
I think it's also something which people really enjoy doing, and it's
Hmm.
kind of a show off of your skill. But I also think it's something which, as a buyer, it's part of the mystique and the intrigue of buying a Labubu, is that you want to go and try and listen yourself and figure it out. And if you're wrong, well, then you join a WeChat group and you trade it.
It takes over the more and more of your attention and your eyeballs and your brain space,
Yeah.
which is what all companies are vying to do in China, essentially.
Yes, exactly. It's an attention market, as we can see here with the virality and with the pure the time that people spend on their phones here
Sure.
is just insane. So it's why you've got to tap into that market.
I want to kind of up along from PopMart, which is one company that's employed all kinds of strategies to hold people's attention,
Yeah,
to another one, which is Pinduoduo, which has been using gamification and the social aspects of commerce for a long time.
yeah,
And just share some news that's come out of Pinduoduo. And as we all know, Pinduoduo is the company behind Temu, the famous or infamous e-commerce platform that takes basically that takes Yiwu, uh, low-cost Chinese products to the world. It seems like Pinduoduo/Temu is making a fairly substantial bet that it can move up the value chain. So it's moving away from very low-cost goods, and
yeah,
it's looking to consolidate its Temu and its Pinduoduo value chain. So
yeah,
what happened is that they have recently in Shanghai committed 100 billion Chinese yuan, that's 14 billion US dollars, to move up the value chain. The way they're going to be doing this is upgrading manufacturing, logistics, and in-house production. So they'll be exerting tighter control over suppliers, their factories. They'll be building on proprietary product lines, much like Amazon did with their proprietary product lines. So they'll
yeah,
take knowledge of which products have done well and sort of in-house them.
yeah,
And Pinduoduo is also moving to improve fulfillment infrastructure. So this is basically a verticalization play where there used to just be a platform that matched buyers in China through Pinduoduo and then Temu internationally with factories in China, and often pushing those factories to carry the costs, often to take a loss, to be able to provide the best possible price to consumers. Now they're looking
yeah,
to shift from a cheap marketplace to a much more controlled retail ecosystem. The one aspect being higher margins, better quality, especially as scrutiny is increasing in terms of very cheap Chinese imports, or actually all Chinese imports across the board.
yeah.
And they're looking to cut out middlemen as well.
Oh, okay.
So essentially, because Temu runs on the same back end as Pinduoduo, which is basically Chinese manufacturing to the world, these investments from Pinduoduo's side are more than likely to spread throughout the whole system and spill over to Temu. It's cheaper and better products hitting the Western markets faster, which will present a challenge to incumbents like Amazon and Walmart. Now, these challenges to the incumbents can be slowed down through regulation, but with the current affordability climate, especially in the US, it seems like better quality products for cheaper will be an unbeatable play that can be stymied but can't be put off indefinitely. So ultimately, Temu is not just undercutting on price anymore. It is really trying to compete on quality at scale. So Kieran, I don't know if you have ever bought anything off Pinduoduo before and what your experience has perhaps been about it.
I must be honest with you, Shoal. So thanks for that really interesting share. I wasn't entirely up to speed on that news. What I've learned about that, well, my experience with Pinduoduo is that as an alternative to Taobao, it is even cheaper, often 20% of the price of what you can get on Taobao.
Yeah.
You know, you can search for things like nice looking watches for $50. It's insane. I have bought some things like toilet paper and various things. Every single thing I've bought, just about every single thing I've bought on Pinduoduo, for whatever reason, is subpar quality. I don't know if they're getting the offcuts from factories, but quality questionable. So I I installed the app on my phone thinking that, I was going to be able to save $50 to $100 every month on small household goods. And I've ended up pretty much using it. I found one or two things which are of, the same quality for a lower price as you would, compared to Taobao. But ultimately, I don't use the app anymore because of how bad the quality is. So this is really interesting news, what you mentioned today. What about yourself? What's your experience?
I think it's pretty much exactly what you said. I have the app and I've considered at times getting, for example, rubbish bags. But when you see a pack of 10 rubbish bag rolls going at what's essentially 10 cents USD, you begin to scratch your head and wonder, do I really want to use something this cheap? Um, my concern is the same as yours. You wonder what kind of dangers are lurking with whatever you're buying off Pinduoduo, because they pass on so much of the cost to factories and saying, just take a hit for a while and then once you get your foot in the door, then you'll be making real money. I don't think these factories are they're not sort of putting their best products forward at all. They are, as you said, they put forward offcuts, substandard kind of stuff. So I do not, as a rule, purchase off Pinduoduo. I haven't used Temu before. I haven't been overseas long enough, honestly, to have used Temu. But I think from a China perspective, it is absolutely warranted that they begin to move
Yeah.
up the value chain, start consolidating, start crunching those costs, such that they can really control and put out excellent products. Because once Chinese brands do consolidate control over manufacturing quality, they tend to do a great job.
So that's interesting you mentioned about the control over quality Shell, because I haven't seen that in many aspects just because I haven't had all the experience. But with regards for my role at Rooibos Limited, I do procure some machinery for various projects that we do and for our own CapEx and also OpEx. And I have seen before that we would never have considered a Chinese solution 10, maybe even 5 years ago. But the reputation of certain Chinese products now, industrial products, is so high that it was so good that you can't actually ignore looking at a Chinese solution, at a Chinese alternative. So I can relate this as well to my reading of a book, which I'm going to recommend to you. You might have read it before, but it's called Poorly Made in China. And that was written about 20 years ago, and it was a foreign guy like us who came to China looking for fame and fortune, probably in the 90s, and started off as an English teacher, learning Chinese on the side, and ended up getting in manufacturing somehow and became a procurement advisor or agent as well for foreign brands or for foreign companies. And one of, his main job was to be the link with the Chinese factories. And he said a lot of the time, Chinese factory, this is back in the day, I don't say that it still applies, but they would not have any funding. They would have a factory with workers who were available to work at any time, but who weren't being paid a full-time salary. They were kind of on standby. And then they would say, right, let's get these. We've got a project. You'd say we want to make soap, and they say, well, okay, we don't really make soap. We haven't done that before, but all right, we'll do it. And then what they do is they give you a very good price at first, and they give you the quality that you're looking for at first. But then over time, in order so in a way that they can make money, so that they can make money, they start to skimp on quality. So they might skimp on ingredients, cut certain ingredients out,
Yeah,
would have cost them money so that they can have that profit margin. So over time, you're paying the same price. You think you've slayed the dragon, but you're getting poorer and poorer quality for the buck, for the same amount of money that you're paying. So
absolutely. Yeah.
that is a concurrent trend, I think, that was very, very prevalent 10, 20 years ago. I'm sure that there are a lot of Chinese factories which still operate on that basis. I can tell you from experience with Rooibos that we visit customers who are in this massive, impressive looking building, and then you go up there and it's just one small, shoddy kind of workshop within that building,
Sure.
and the
Yeah.
building's desolate. But obviously that isn't necessarily the rule or the exception. That's an example. However, yeah, as I said, with regards to when they double down on quality, there are a lot of things. I have seen really good examples of really, really high, quality product, which is cheaper than the German alternative, for example, or the European or American alternative. So that
Sure.
is certainly a case. However, in terms of costs, Chinese salaries are still much lower. Um, so than, for example, Western salaries in general. But were they to go up in future, then it might be more difficult to get to compete on those costs, depending on the level of automation that is involved in the factory. So
If I can just add to that with another, so I'm interesting that you mentioned the quality aspect because I think what it does is that it plays perfectly well with manufacturing exports, but it tends to China tends to run into some limitations when it comes to food and medicines, and that kind of I want to bring that back to semaglutides, or the so-called Jianfeizhen, the weight loss injection, which I've suddenly began to notice in Shanghai is going quite viral or mainstream, especially with the young ladies over here.
hmm,
Weight loss injections are absolutely going mainstream in China, especially now as the core patents for semaglutides are expiring now in March of 2026 as we speak. Since the patent has expired, over 10 Chinese firms have entered the market. The prices have dropped to around 200 Chinese yuan per month, and this is a global market of $36 billion according to sales in 2025. Now, what this signals is that semaglutides are shifting from a premium drug to a more massified consumer product with generics popping up in China. So it's in large parts driven in China also by influencers, as it is in the West, and it's becoming more of a lifestyle choice, not just medical. So as we were talking about with maybe some of the, the high competitive pressures, the gradual cutting of costs to increase margins, I would say that with semaglutides in China, you'll find wealthier markets stick to imported brands, and you'll see limited success of Chinese semaglutides exporting to developed markets because FDA and EMA certification and trust is difficult to get, and that will still secure it a premium both internationally and within the China market. And
yeah.
for then the local Chinese market, more affordable domestic generics will then flourish absolutely. Because as we might discuss later on with health, China is a country very much in the throes of more lifestyle-based, sedentary, high blood pressure, unhealthy eating habits. They're sort of beginning to enter that space for public health concerns. So I would say with these semaglutide companies popping up in China is that China will absolutely dominate volume within China and also to emerging markets where FDA and EMA certification is not as much of a big
Yeah.
deal, while the established Western incumbents will still keep the premium segments is the way I would see it. Kieran, I would like to ask you, have you also noticed this uptick in semaglutides use in your circles?
So I haven't yet, Shoal, and I think that's because I haven't actually. I've noticed a lot of it in my circles in, Europe and South Africa, for example, where friends, especially young girls that feel they're a little bit overweight, are doing Ozempic.
Mm,
And I actually haven't, from an anecdotal perspective, I've seen that kind of I'm not so sure that it's that good. I think that losing weight naturally and keeping it off naturally and building a healthy lifestyle, it would be a much better alternative just because
absolutely.
It just basically it it hires your level of satiety very quickly. So you feel that you full very, very early on in a meal, which means that you eat a lot less, but then you're not getting all your nutrients. So
Absolutely. Yeah.
you might look good in the interim, but we don't know what the long-term effects of under eating will be. So there has been on the health side. I know we're not a health channel here. Health is part of what I do with Roy Borson with my blog, the Health Span Plan. But there was an experiment done on rats where they took like they cut the amount of food that the rats in the control group were eating for by 33%, and then the other rats continued to eat their normal amount of calories. And the rats that had their calories cut by a third, by 33%, ended up living for a third longer. So that's quite interesting. It's like there might be that cutting, but I think that with these drugs, I don't know about the same applies to the Chinese drugs, it must cut your calories by even more. I mean, at least from what
Mhm.
I've seen with people around me. So anyway, I kind of want to say, and we can discuss this, these peptides or these more, but in China you spoke about high blood pressure. There's been a news incident recently where a 41-year-old influencer was basically died of a heart attack, cardiac arrest. His name was Zhang Xiefeng, and there has been a massive backlash online on Chinese social media, with people saying that, he died of overwork. He's a health influencer, and here he is at 41 dying because he's working too hard. And the stats that I've seen are showing that there are one annual heart attacks in China that are recorded, and that more than a quarter are people under 45 years old, which
Yeah.
Zhang Xiefeng would be included on. And that kind of raises the question, the big debate online now is about how this 996, so 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week, this work culture is affecting people's health, and whether it's worthwhile for that extra $1,000 a month, for most people, which is is it really worthwhile to push yourself that hard, um, especially if it's going to cut your lifespan in half or just maim you in your 40s. So I've got an interesting stat to show you. When I first came to China around 10 years ago, the predicted lifespan for a person born, you know, today or then at the time, a person who was just born was 71 years old. But that's gone up to 78 years now. And at the time when China was 71, the US was 79 years old. Now the US has actually dropped slightly for various reasons to 78.8 years. So China's only, uh, it's less than a year behind the US now. However, an increase in lifespan does not necessarily, equate to an increase in health span.
Sure.
So what is your experiential of people around you, kind of, especially your Chinese friends and your Chinese colleagues and customers? How would you rate their lifestyles and their approach to health and their kind of, yeah, just their lifestyles in general and their health in general? How would you rate that?
Geez, it's pretty bleak, eh? I mean, if you can go anywhere outside of hospitals, outside of malls, um, anywhere in Shanghai, Shanghai being perhaps a more health conscious city, and you will find people smoking like chimneys, almost everywhere.
Yeah,
You'll see delivery guys, in their yellow or in their orange delivery outfits. Think DoorDash drivers, but under much, much more pressure.
yeah,
Running these insane schedules. Um, to be honest, you mentioned sacrificing one's health for the extra 1,000 USD. For delivery drivers in China, which are sort of pretty much, I don't want to say the lowest level employees, but in terms of urban employment, they pretty much scrape the bottle,
yeah,
scrape the bottom, is 1,000 USD is what they're getting.
yeah,
It's not extra, it's everything.
It's everything, yeah.
which they will often sort of save up to be able to buy a property back in their hometown in a small county so that they can get married. But for them running 12-hour days, 6, 7 days a week, I mean, a cigarette, chain smoking is what kind of keeps them mentally able to keep going
Yeah.
under such high pressure. Uh, and if you, I mean, it does point back to, sort of China's highly competitive workforce. It's a highly educated, highly motivated workforce with still a fairly significant, I don't want to say backlog, but a population of rural, ambitious people who want to do better than their parents did. It's not that, don't look at Shanghai and see it as a representation of, that China has arrived. It's China still has, provincial China still is very much motivated to make a better go of things than their parents have had,
Yes.
because they often come from rural settings. They've maybe had only a generation or two where there's been very fairly respectable living standards, running water, electricity, university education. So China is absolutely in that stage where it's working its hardest to still squeeze out growth and wealth, but it's obviously running into the speed limits of how much one can do in such a competitive market. Honestly, if I was a young guy from a rural part of China right now, I would try my best to get to Southeast Asia, to Africa, and try and make a go of things there because it's just so competitive in China. I don't see how I would make it having my fairly limited skill set, having fairly limited networks, arriving in a big city and having to, be on a scooter for 12, 13 hours a day.
Yeah.
I would collapse at some point, absolutely.
Yeah. And Shoal, I agree with you. Do you know how many, I've seen this stat before, but how many people are doing this delivery, it's called YMI, so food delivery at the moment. Have you got any idea?
No, no idea.
Okay, so 7 million people across China. That's a conservative estimate. That's amount
It's
of
huge.
people that are doing this. Yeah, and almost I think it was almost all men before, but now you do see more and more women doing it because if you can earn $1,000 doing that, which is kind of the top end of a delivery driver, especially in Shanghai, or delivery rider rather, it's probably double the salary they could get at home, if not more. When I say at home, somewhere in a small county outside of Shanghai or somewhere further inland.
Oh yeah,
So, and that's
yeah.
doing office job. So you see who actually have a qualified, with a degree saying, well, look, if I can make double the amount or 2,000 extra, let's say $500 extra per month, I should rather do that for a few years, accumulate enough savings, and then, as you say, buy a house or something. The problem is obviously is that there are 36 million excess men. So even in the best of scenarios, when all of those delivery drivers can buy a house, there are going to still be a lot of people who, statistically speaking, will never find wives because there just won't be any women available, or not enough women available. So that's also unfortunate in a way, but there is also hope. And when I say hope, because of the fact that people can still find jobs, even if they feel that they're overqualified for a job, that's surviving in the moment and having money to pay for immediate expenses and be able to save is more than a lot of countries can say. We're both from South Africa and we know that there are unfortunately a lot of people who really, really struggle and they just have jobs for all the relatively, unskilled labor. So,
Yes,
I
100%.
think you are starting to see smaller trends now in fact bigger trends too, you can say. So since the pandemic, people are they're a lot more than before on health issues. So for example, heating things up in plastic, the delivery stuff that you get when you order in. That's obviously, you might not have BPA, but you've got BFS and another type of plastic which just hasn't they secrete microplastics which are carcinogens. But I'm sure that those experiments and that medical research is not far off. So people are very much aware of that, and people are becoming more informed, and there are more people who are, choosing to eat organic food, which wasn't a thing at all a few years ago. And they're also choosing to eat, kind of, I wouldn't say that people choosing to go fully plant-based, but if you see that the Shanghainese government a few years ago, they had a kind of a food dial which recommended how much of each certain types of foods you should eat a day. Because at the moment there's just this, the food that's especially popular is food from Chongqing and Sichuan. It's very oily, spicy food. And it is absolutely delicious. It's addictive because of the pheromone, or not the pheromones, sorry, the endorphins that it releases.
Mm.
Hopefully pheromones as well. But that is basically, yeah, it's not healthy. And then of course with the late nights and with, how, people here, I think in general, the Economist came out with a kind of an analysis of how people slept in different countries and when they went to sleep and when they woke up. And China is one of the countries with a pretty late sleeping time and a pretty early, wake up time. So not getting enough sleep is obviously also not ideal. Anyway, but you are still seeing, you are still searches as well. There's more questions about these things and more interest in health,
Sure.
and things that which will not just people live longer, but which will actually make people have live longer with a quality kind of, level of health. So have longer health spans basically. So that's encouraging. And Shoal, I don't know if you've heard about this other news, and it's not necessarily new news, but a lot of health is linked to what you eat. And to have good health, you need to have good protein. And China's done a very good job with that. Obviously, I choose to eat plant-based protein for environmental reasons, but there has been a big, in the past, pig meat in China was very much seen as not a delicacy, but sign of the good life. And
Mm.
people typically didn't have enough. If you go back to when China wasn't very as wealthy as it is now, 20, 15, 20 years ago, having, your pig meat with your meal once or twice a week was very much seen as, you've arrived kind of a moment. And now, have you seen the news about this 26-story hog factory in Hubei province?
It sounds terrible, but I haven't heard about it. Please enlighten me.
Okay, so in 2022, or around then, towards the end of the pandemic, this hog factory was, and obviously with China's speed, that was established and built very quickly. So China is now producing 40% more pig meat than it was in 2020, and that it's now responsible for half of the world's total consumption, which is, so it's 20% of the population, or in fact, it's not even 20% of the population anymore because population's hit about, it's probably, let's say, 17% of the population, with 8 billion people and 1.4 here. So, but either way, that's a massive, that shows that people in China are consuming 3 times more pork or pig meat than the average person in the world. So just to give you an idea now of what the current news is, they in 2020, people, in fact, in 2023, people consumed 28 kilograms of pig meat per year. However, by 2024, that had dropped to 2 kilograms, that had 6 kilograms. So the what an analysts and everything that I've read on, what they reckon is that this is because people perceive pig meat to be a healthier or less healthy alternative to the likes of chicken and seafood.
Mm.
I'm not so sure why. That would be interesting for me to look into what that is, but this has basically meant that there's now the capacity that they are producing at would have kind of, but now there's kind of an overcapacity, um, which in fact has resulted in the prices of live pigs in China reaching a 15-year low this month in March this year. So there are even reports of some farmers making a 300 RMB loss per pig.
Jeez.
Yeah. So anyway, though, in China's new drive to open up shop abroad, this one of the top kind of pig meat producers in China called Muyuan Foodstuffs has is trying to replicate this model in Vietnam. So if you're driving around in Vietnam and you see an odd looking high rise, which is as broad as it is tall, then you might know that that might be rearing 1.6 million hogs per year. So yeah,
Wow.
that's where we're heading. Yeah.
Sure, that's incredible. And I'm sure that automation plays no small role in what they're doing, which kind of brings me to the next story, which is maybe not as dystopian as Muyan Foodstuffs
Yeah.
hog raising high rises.
Yeah.
Unitree Robotics filing for IPO on the STAR market, the Shanghai Stock Exchange, um, or a special variant of the Shanghai Stock Exchange, filing for IPO. Now, Unitree is the first profitable humanoid robot company. So just to give you an idea of their revenue, 1.7 billion Chinese yuan per year. That's 335% growth year on year. Now, their profit is what's really quite astounding is it's over 600 million RMB with a
Wow.
gross margin of 60%. So they've shipped 5,500, but more than 5,500 humanoids in 2025, and they've to crunch their prices from 593,000 Chinese yuan to a low 168,000 RMB. So what is sort of salient about this is that most robotics companies worldwide lose money, but Unitree is actually beginning to make money off humanoid robotics at scale. Now, their sort of specialization is full stack control of hardware and software. And because they're in China, because they're at the center of the sort of the OEM, the manufacturing ecosystem, they cut down costs aggressively. And they are also very close to real life commercial demand, be it research, be it industry, and be it also education. For example, teaching students how to work with robots of the future. Now, they are specifically investing into, as we might all know, China is going big into embodied AI, the brain, such that when you speak to it, it's a fairly coherent sort of interlocutor. And then interestingly is the body, motion control, how it interacts with the environment. So it seems like China is really pulling ahead with moving humanoid robots from the demo phase through to a deployable product that can ultimately potentially replace humans in certain job roles. Kieran, I'd like to ask your point of view if you have considered buying a robot yet, or is this something that you would like to first see how it plays out?
No, I don't see any immediate need. I don't actually think what kind of robot would you be looking for?
You said just now is the a few big areas, and that would be sort of cleaning and basic hygiene, and then also maybe elder care being a big concern. You know, people, and that would kind of put nurses, carers, and sort of cleaners and janitors probably in the firing line as embodied AI gets better and better at certain tasks. Blue collar workers and care workers will see quite a significant disruption. And I think to be clear, I think it was last year the Shanghai municipal government put aside several billion RMB in an investment fund for innovation in elder care. So this is something that China is, whether it likes to or not, is facing a very aging population very rapidly, as is most of the developed world, and East Asia being a pretty sore spot for that in any case. So China will need to stake a lot of its elder care um, on robots in the future, most likely. I'm also very concerned and interested to see in how it might play into various economies around the world. Specifically, as you know, we're both South African, and the degree to which labor dynamics have informed South African politics and economy, from mining to services to the entire workforce of South Africa, it seems quite bleak in terms of the South African economy, and in terms of maybe the entire sort of blue collar worker economy when you can have robots doing hazardous jobs in mines, on oil rigs. How do you see, from a South African perspective, how do you see robots, especially from China's side with embodied AI, just reverberating through that economy and society?
So, Charles, to start off with China and with the need for elderly care workers, especially, China's going to need that because we discussed last week was that China's current dependency ratio is 45%, which is pretty decent, but the trends are almost invariably and inevitably is that China's going to, over the next 50 to 100 years, is going to become the country with the highest kind of dependency ratio, or the worst dependency ratio in the world, just because of the fact that it's got this mismatch of boys to girls or men to women, and especially in, concentrated in, younger demographics. So, and with the fact that people are having less, well, which is one of the reasons, fueling the fact that people are having less kids. So China is going to need, just as much kind of basic labor as possible to be able to keep the economy going, to be able to look, to meet these basic needs and to look after people, especially with the fact that so many people here are getting the opportunity to go into higher education, whether that's university or a really good vocational college. You're just seeing you are gonna need robots to help. From a humanistic perspective, with elderly people, there's going to be a lot more than just being able to, sorry to use the crude term, but to bring someone's food in order to, to help people with going to the bathroom or whatever. Also, it's about that contact and that care. And in a world where people are having fewer kids, and or when people's kids just don't visit them very often, which unfortunately you do see with some elderly people, it's also going to be about that in-person contact. So I don't see them displacing those kinds of jobs at all. I see them being a massive aid. I think because if anything, there's only going to be more of a demand for nurses and for care workers,
Mm-hmm.
and that the name of the job or the role of the job might change, but it's going to be more about providing that in-person care, about being that person's friend and confidant. Um,
Sure.
so I think, though, from a South African perspective, they're dangerous jobs like that. If we can find working in a deep mine pit or doing a deep dive in very dangerous conditions, if we can get a robot to do it, I'm all for it. I do think that this will raise a very different question, though, and that's about this a universal basic income for many workers, who will be displaced in places like South Africa, and that's got to be paid for by firms who can save on these costs. The problem is, though, is that if they're implemented in South Africa and they're not implemented in China, for example, and that we let's assume we had the same price on some kind of product before, that'll make us uncompetitive because we don't have, because now the costs have come down in China because they're using robots as, the work for workers, but the costs have gone up in South Africa, or they've stayed the same because they're using the difference to sponsor workers universal basic income, or to give them, to upgrade or enhance their education, give them a chance to take educational courses so that they can move out of, the blue labor or the blue collar sector. So that is also an issue. So this universal basic income is almost something which has to be more of a global initiative, I think. Yeah, it doesn't looking good because I can see maybe not in the next 5 years, but once robots get that kind of dexterity as well, and the price of energy comes down, I can see that definitely um, causing even more of an upset and even more of an unemployment crisis in countries where a lot of the population is unfortunately very low skilled. What do you think?
Absolutely. I mean, I mentioned South Africa because we're both from South Africa, but also because it's been quite a, sort of a laboratory for relations and how technology and trade and globalization can really disrupt um, human relations and societies and can really scar communities. I think that South Africa is a very tough case study that one can almost game out how you know fleets of robots uh, rendering people unemployable for the most part might play out. And as you say, the necessity for and for policy to catch up and to be ahead of these things,
Yeah,
where people are essentially rendered to be impediments in the way of enterprises.
yeah,
We need to start thinking very seriously and long and hard about what do we envision the future of people as being? People like us who have families and communities who aren't just communities that you can displace. They're people with rights. So this is I'd be very interested to see and to comment on the future of how AI hits, working people across BRICS, across developed nations, across emerging markets. But I think I'm cautiously pessimistic because I don't know in the sort of struggle between capital and workers, it's historically not always turned for the working class. But
yeah.
let's park that for now and go on to a pretty cool tool that has just emerged from Alibaba Group, and
Sure.
that is Chen1 AI's AI within the AMAP ecosystem. That's called a detour,
Yeah,
where you can essentially ask AI to book your taxi ride end to end. Now, that sounds like a lot, but if I can just kind of break it down, imagine if Google Maps had an AI assistant that you could call an Uber through, and it was seamless. You just asked it to do it, and you said, for example, under 20 RMB or under $3, no carpool, and I want a fairly snazzy looking newer car. Don't give me sort of a hunk
yeah,
of junk. And the AI executes the entire ride booking, no clicking, no filters, no permissions. It's just like runs you straight through.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
Now, AMAP or Gauda Detour is sort of the Alibaba's proprietary Maps app, navigation app, which is obviously then used to book taxis and so forth, sort of like Google Maps.
yeah,
Now, this just shows that China is moving from not just chatting like we do with LLMs, but to actually acting, being an agent,
yeah.
actually closing the loop between what your intent is digitally and then the execution in the real world. So
Sure.
um, this is where China has actually pulled ahead quite significantly, and I think we've seen this perhaps even 10 years ago or 15 years ago with the introduction of for example, WeChat Pay, is that China has these very well developed super app ecosystems where payments, maps, services are all integrated. And Chinese people are quite comfortable and quite happy to do away with some of the privacy and regulatory sort of barriers that we might tend to cling on to in the West. And
Yes.
if I had to just comment on this as someone who lives in China, is that I've become much more chilled and lax with privacy and permissions and so on. I mean, maybe this is a way that China has influenced me, but I tend to feel like whoever's collecting the data, who's kind of the companies that are kind of working with this data, they are well regulated. I trust them for the most part. They're not going to use it to do something that is in my significant disinterest. I tend to feel like every single app is trying to scam my money, and I have some precedent for, and my brother recently got scammed
Yeah.
through a phishing link, or someone hacked his banking app. I would say that these concerns are warranted in places like South Africa, where there's just a proliferation, extreme proliferation of scams
Yeah.
and just financial trickery of all sorts. Whereas in China, I have yet to encounter anything of that sort. And that's because China has obviously more standardized and digitized services. Um, but essentially, what I want to say here is that China at the moment is a better regulated, high trust digital services ecosystem, such that it's not just a cultural Chinese thing. It's once you're in this ecosystem of trusting these digital players more, because they do tend to be good actors by and large. I think this is fairly incontrovertible. That means you can then reap these rewards of having AI agents acting on your behalf, such that you trust them to go ahead, and that there will be a very fast and reasonable recourse if you in the Chinese e-commerce and digital services sector. That's just my experience. Kieran, if you've had any experiences to the contrary, I'd love for you to push back, because from what you've said so far, I do surmise that you are a bit more focused on privacy and data security. What's your take on this?
So sure, I think that I would agree with you to the extent that once you're in the system, it does work well, and it's very, very rare that you hear of people, well, I've never heard of anybody losing money because they've used, Alipay, or because they've used WeChat Pay. I often choose to use cash here, and that puts me in a tiny percentage of people. But if we're giving away all of our information to companies, they know more about our precise habits, purchasing habits, when they know when we wake up in the morning, all of these things. And that, obviously, I don't think that most of them have access to, or that it's often just being used as metadata. But I don't want to get into the stage where I'm the frog who got into warm water and who's now in boiling water and has no more skin and is living in 1984. And that is my, if everything's digitalized and people are just giving out all their information and sharing all their thoughts and using, DeepSeek as their psychologist, we could easily find ourselves in that scenario. So I don't know how relevant this is to today's podcast, but I'm I'm very much a skeptic. That said, I don't think that there's any harm in using the AI ride-hailing app, because if we're already using these apps, often what you've got to decide is, does the convenience of using them outweigh the potential privacy risks? And for most apps in China, I trust that my money's not going to be fished out of me like it could be in South Africa or elsewhere in the world.
Mhm.
And I'm willing to use them. So all in all, yeah, that's my conclusion. It's all about convenience versus privacy. And I think every individual should do their research and weigh that up.